Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/historyfangirl. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Kindle, Android, or MP3 player.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Craig. Welcome to the History of Fangirl podcast. This is episode 20, Belgrade, the Rise of the White City. The rise and fall of the former Yugoslavia is part of the history of the 20th century, but the horrific war crimes and genocide that ensued as it broke apart sit firmly at the crossroads between the past and current events. For many outside the Balkans, the violence and cultural upheaval is hard to understand, enshrined in a fog of confusion. My guest today is Alex Cruikshanks, host of the podcast The History of Yugoslavia. We chat about how Belgrade, the White City, rose from a Serbian backwater to become the capital of Yugoslavia, how Yugoslavia managed to have relative prosperity, and what the hell happened when it all broke apart.
My guest today is Alex Cruikshanks. He is the host of the History of Yugoslavia podcast. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Stephanie. Good to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on. So I did not know about your podcast when I was backpacking around Yugoslavia, or the former Yugoslavia, which I seriously regret now, because when I got there, it would have been really great if I had been listening already. I mean, I've been to every country now in the former Yugoslavia, and since coming back, I've gotten seriously interested in Yugoslav history, and I found your podcast, and I'm devouring it. So how did you get interested in creating a podcast about the history of Yugoslavia?
Well, it's kind of an odd story. Basically, I was at university and I got really intrigued by the study of genocide and ethnic conflict, as morbid as that is. And in particular, I got really interested by the Bosnian War in the 1990s. I still really want to do a PhD related to that. And so I sort of sat around thinking, how can I better prepare myself for this PhD and make myself a better candidate? And it was at this point which I sort of came across Mike Duncan's History of Rome and binge listened to that for
I think as months. We all have.
Yeah. And I thought, I could do this. And when I originally started it, I was thinking I would really just be talking about the 1990s. And I'd have a couple of episodes of background to set it all up. But then I'd go on straight into talking about Milosevic and all of that. But then I started doing the background research because I really didn't know that much about the pre-World War II history of the region. My knowledge really only went back to World War II, and I really only had a knowledge of the outline before that. But as I started researching it, I thought, no, this is bigger, this is more important than I thought it was, and the story grew the more I researched it. And even if you go back to the first episode of my podcast, like I'm still expecting there that the 19th century stuff is only going to take me a handful of episodes, and I'm now 17 episodes in, and this is still going to be quite a few until I get to World War One. So
when I was in school, so I'm 33, so I was in school learning real world history classes after the fall of Yugoslavia. I don't really remember talking about Yugoslavia much, except when we talked about Pan-Slavism, the rise of World War I, and the fall of the Ottoman Empire. But even that was kind of not, it was a theme, but it wasn't like a whole project in and of itself. And then, so like when I was in school, Zlata's diary, which was like a kind of like an Anne Frank style diary of the 90s conflict, that was out, and she was about my age. And so I remember reading about that, but I still didn't process much. And then when I was there this summer, I realized I learned a lot, but I mostly realized like how freaking little I knew and how much more work I had to do.
There was a similar earlier when I was younger, when I was about 12 or 13. I can remember in a religious studies class. I can't remember for what reason, but we read this account of a massacre that had taken place in Bosnia, about a boy who, with all the men from his village, had been forced to walk through a minefield.
Oh, wow.
He'd survived, basically, by pretending to be dead. covered in body parts. And that was obviously quite a harrowing story for a 12-year-old, and particularly when we all found out that had happened in 1993, around the time we'd all been born. And yeah, because I'm 23, I should point out. It felt much closer to home than and I don't mean to play down earlier atrocities, but it made it feel a lot closer to home that it had happened so recently and in our lifetimes.
From my personal background, it seems so difficult to understand. And then you get there, and I think just like you were saying with the podcast, like unfolding and realizing there are so many stories you need to tell before you start telling the story. It's like I realized, like, every time you heard about an atrocity, you're like, oh, well, the other people on the other side of that were so wrong. And then I would go to their country and hear like, well, actually, those people did something to them 100 years before. And it just goes on and on and on backwards in time until you're talking literally about like ancient peoples. There's never like a century without an atrocity. And it's so different than the way that I grew up in my country's history that I don't know if I'll ever really understand it, but I think it's worth studying. And I think it's really cool that you're putting it out into the world in a way that people can consume it in a popular way, in the same way that like Roman history is now much more accessible.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Belgrade. So today we're going to focus on Belgrade because Belgrade has an interesting position in the middle of all of this Yugoslav history. And even saying Yugoslav history is kind of controversial unless you're talking specifically about the years when it was a country. Where did Belgrade start?
Well, the first thing we really know about Belgrade, apart from beyond the early settlement years, is the Roman fortress town of Singidunum on the Danube. This sort of like sets the stage for what Belgrade's going to be for most of its history, and in terms of where it's geographically positioned. You know, like from any reasonably high up place in Belgrade, you can usually see the river.
Yeah.
Yeah. And often you can see both rivers. And the nature of those rivers is that they form a natural border, the Danube in particular. And for most of Roman history, the Danube was the border of the Roman Empire. And so if you looked across the river, you were looking into another country. And that's been the situation in Belgrade for a lot of its history. It's been a military outpost, the northernmost military outpost on the Danube of the state or empire that was controlling it at the time. And you don't really get a sense of that if you just get out a map and look at a map of Serbia, because Belgrade looks like it's smack bang in the middle of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other river, this is embarrassing. I didn't know about the Sava River until I got there. I hadn't really thought about the geography of Belgrade. I actually only added it to my itinerary because I didn't want to try to get from Kosovo to Croatia in one day. So I was like, I'll go hang out in Belgrade for a few days. Got there. Became obsessed with it. Like, modern Serbia is kind of a wonderful place to hang out. I wouldn't tell that to people in Kosovo, but I actually really loved Belgrade, and I had some of the best Mexican food in Europe in Belgrade, and I had a great time there. I was there for almost a week. But yeah, before I got there, had not thought much about the geography, didn't realize it had two rivers. Like, I literally went in almost blind, except for like a couple podcast episodes I'd listened to about Tito. Didn't know how much the love that they still have for Tito. I mean, like, I literally knew almost nothing. So I'm excited that we're going to do kind of a big sweeping history, because I think more Americans, when they travel around the Balkans, should stop there. And I don't know what people know about before they get there. But yeah, I hadn't thought about the geography.
Yeah, well, what I was going to basically go on from that to say is, because it's a border military city, it's fought over a lot. There's a lot of war going on over the region, both in the classical world, in Roman times, and in early modern history. Basically, by the time we get to about 1800, just before the first Serbian uprising, the first Serbian War for Independence essentially starts, it's a very underpopulated region of the world. It's been occupied by the Austrians, and then they've been driven out about 15 times. It's been damaged so much by war, and it's not particularly very well populated.
So Serbia is part of the area of Europe that was conquered by the Ottomans.
Mm-hmm.
And that legacy is treated differently in different parts of the Balkans. What is Belgrade's relationship to its Ottoman past and kind of what happened there?
Well, first I'll say that the Ottoman governing method, sort of the way they administered the lands they ruled, there was very little role for local, I don't want to say Serbs at this point because the idea of a Serb nation is, in a sense, a later idea. So at the moment, I'll just call them, like, say, Slavic Orthodox Christians in the region. Because it's hard at this point to distinguish between a Serb and a Bulgarian and a Macedonian and a Bosniak. Because they all speak dialects of, to an extent, the same language. They're not codified different languages. But, there's very little role for them in government. Most of the government is governing positions are reserved for Muslims. And most of those Muslims aren't Turkish colonists. They're local Slavs who've converted to Islam, essentially so they can get a leg up in government.
So the people that are local Muslims now that are in Serbia are people's family members and cousins and relatives that just have become Muslim because it made sense for their personal lives to become Muslim?
Sort of. That's the way it works, I guess, in the first generation or two. But over time, because their children are raised as Muslims and their grandchildren are raised as Muslims, and so on, you see the emergence of a distinct Muslim Slavic community.
What is Belgrade like under Ottoman rule?
It's centered around the Kalemegdan, the Turkish fortress, right on the intersection between the two rivers. And towards the end of Ottoman rule, it's a very small town. As late as 1850, which is about 40 years after the Ottomans have left, the population of Belgrade is still only about 15,000.
Oh, wow. So I didn't realize that the Ottoman Empire left Belgrade a lot earlier than it left.
They left in stages. There was the 1804 uprising, the 1804 uprising, where there's basically a Serbian peasant uprising, where they force all the Ottomans out for about 10 years before it gets reconquered. And then there's a second uprising, which establishes sort of a vassal state, which is sort of independent, but not really. And so where basically the local population can run their own affairs, but the Ottomans do maintain a garrison in Belgrade, and that stays there till 1867.
Okay. So, but they still had more independence than like Bulgarians and Macedonians did much earlier.
Oh, yeah. There is the existence of a Serbian state. There is a Prince of Serbia, there's a Prime Minister of Serbia. They have their own institutions, but they aren't fully independent yet.
So what happens between it being this backwater in this area that is thwarting Ottoman rule to it becoming the capital of the kingdom that emerges at the end of all of this, which is, I believe it's the kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes?
Well, it starts off as the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, and then becomes Yugoslavia. It happens almost by accident, in a sense. There's an idea that it's going to happen, but nobody would have really expected it to happen in the way it did. Yugoslavism as an idea is mostly an idea of Slavs in the Austrian Habsburg Empire.
Okay.
Who's basically this idea to unify Slovenes and Croats and Serbs so that they'll get their own special entity or even independence from the Austrians.
Just to check in, I believe that Croatia and Slovenia were under control of the Habsburgs, but because Serbia had been under the control of the Ottomans, they want to unite those areas, but they had not been united for hundreds of years.
Yeah, a long time, yeah, if at all. There's an idea in Serbia that they want to expand, but they don't really see expanding into Bosnia and Croatia as a viable idea. They think the Austrians are too strong for them to seriously look at expanding in that direction. They want to expand south into Kosovo and Macedonia and Albania. And that's where they initially looked to expand towards. So if in the Balkan Wars, which happened just before the First World War in 1912 and 1913, that's when Serbia annexes Kosovo and the Sanjak and Macedonia. Yugoslavia can only really come about because of the sudden collapse of the Habsburg Empire at the end of World War One, which no one would have seen coming 5-10 years before.
Yeah, no, I think that was one of those things that people, how could you predict something like that had never happened before? So let's talk a little bit about Serbia's role in World War One and even bringing World War One about, because I think people know that there was an assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, but I don't know if they really understand like the politics behind that and that had to do with Serbs.
Yeah, like I say, there's been these sort of competing ideas around Slavic expansion in the Balkans going around for a while. One is, of course, this Yugoslavist ideal that's really coming from the Slavs in the Habsburg Empire, that there'll be this one grand united Slavic state from Slovenia down to Macedonia and maybe even Bulgaria as well. But they see themselves as distinct tribes or subgroups of one Slavic people, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah. Whereas the contrasting idea in Serbia is this idea of Greater Serbia, Serb nationalism, of expanding to everywhere where there are Serbs. It's not really this idea of different Slavic peoples all coming together to form one state. It's they're different people. We want to just expand to the Serb areas. There is sort of cooperation between these ideas because they do, to a large extent, want some of the same goals. Like they want Bosnia and Serbia to be in the same state, for example, which puts them into conflict with the Austrians when Austria occupies Bosnia in 1878 and then annexes it in 1908, which triggers a lot of rage in Serbia because they saw that as their destined area to expand into. And so they start propagandizing in Bosnia with Yugoslavist and Serb nationalist ideas. And yeah, they really want to expand into Bosnia. And that's the situation we're in, where suddenly Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in July 1914 by Gavrilo Princip, who is Princip is a Yugoslavist. He's a believer in the idea of Yugoslavia, but he is being supported by more hardline Serb nationalist groups in Serbia itself, particularly backed by the army.
So his organization, the Black Hand, was a Serb nationalist group, or was that something separate?
Princip is part of a group called Young Bosnia.
Okay.
Which is a Yugoslavist group, or a pan-Slavist group, I guess you could say. They are being supported by the Black Hand, which is a sort of underground Serb nationalist group of Serbian military officers who are essentially using this group of young, naive students called Young Bosnia to push their own Serb nationalist agenda.
Now, throughout World War One, what are Serbians doing to push Serb nationalism, or what's going on behind the scenes there? Because I feel like when I learned about World War One, the narrative shifts from what happens in Sarajevo to England and Germany, and I feel like so much of the time Americans we never go back in and check on Belgrade and what's going on there.
There is sort of cooperation with diaspora Yugoslavist committees, like Croat politicians who've been exiled from the Austrian Empire for being Yugoslavists, and the sort of links between them and the Serbian government, and they sort of try to build up this idea of this pan-Slavist legion. But yeah, that's not actually that big a deal. It's mostly when it comes to the end of the war and Serbia can suddenly lay claim to all of this territory that has ceased to be part of the Austrian Empire, because essentially the Yugoslavia, or the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, as it's called at first, that emerges from World War One, is an expanded kingdom of Serbia.
Now, what was the kingdom like in the early days, and how did Belgrade become the capital?
Belgrade becomes the capital of Serbia back in 1841. Prior to that, the capital had been in Kragujevac, which is further south, and it was more central to the early Principality of Serbia. So it's 1841 when Belgrade becomes the capital officially. But like I say, then it's still a small town. It's not until World War I when Belgrade passes 100,000 people. I did talk about this in one of my episodes, but it's sort of like the way in the 19th century, the way the Serbian political elite and the royal family, they want to think that they're a state on the big stage, competing with the big boys like Germany and Austria and Britain and France, and they're really not. They're some minor state that no one cares about. So Belgrade in the late 19th century is still a very small town with dirt tracks rather than roads, and with no running water system, and in which farmers bring their pigs through because it's the last stop on the trading route before they go into Hungary to sell their meat. And yes, it's not a modern city at all, but in the middle of Belgrade at the time, you've got these fancy new palaces and government ministry buildings to make it look like it's London or Berlin or Vienna. And they create a bubble for themselves, essentially, in which they want to think that they're a state like all the others in Europe.
Well, so when I was there, because I all of a sudden was realizing that I needed to know more about Belgrade, I bought this novel in a bookstore because it was a lot of countries that have languages that are not widely spoken abroad, like Serbia and Serbian, will have, novels that they have made available in translation into English that's their, national literature, but it may not be literature that everyone knows everywhere, but they really want to make sure that their stories are told abroad. And there's this novel called Kaya, Belgrade, and the Good American. And it's a really fun novel. It is a little bit racist against Asians just because it was not written by people that share the exact same values that Western democracies have now. But even though I don't know if my president might say similar things, but it's a really good picture of like this woman who's like, she's like not an aristocrat, but she is an aristocrat. And it's just like a fun picture of what Belgrade was like between the wars. And then it kind of ends when World War II, with like the destruction of, not the destruction, but when they have to basically flee because of bombing. But if anybody's interested in learning like really what was Belgrade like during this time, this novel is really fun. I'm just going to say, just heads up, as most novels that are not written today do have a little bit of racism and misogyny in it. So read it with a critical eye, but it is really good. And it's called Kaya, Belgrade, and the Good American. And it's also fun to see an American diplomat in Belgrade at the time and how he's reacting to it. I don't know if you've ever heard of the novel, but it's really fun.
Doesn't ring a bell, but I'll check it out.
So
I don't know, perhaps I just say that the state that emerges in Serbia around Belgrade almost happens by accident. No one in the local population, for the local Slavic Orthodox population, really has any experience of governing or being in charge of anything, apart from like very local village leaders. Most people in power under Ottoman rule are Muslims, and the few who aren't tend to be Greek Christians, because it's the Greek Christians who dominate the church, and Greek is the language of education. And in Belgrade province, before the start of the first Serbian uprising, there are only 2 schools, and both of them teach in Greek rather than in Serbian.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And so this state, which essentially comes about as a result of a peasant revolt, not because of a carefully planned war of independence, suddenly results in 1815 in them having a quasi-independent state, which they are really not prepared to run. Most of them can't even read. Like the first prince of Serbia, Miloš Obrenović, in 1815, he couldn't read.
Oh, really?
And so he had to bring in loads of Slavs from the Habsburg Empire to run the country for him because he had no experience of running a country.
Oh, wow. How was he selected to be the prince?
He was the warlord who won the second uprising, essentially.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the Ottoman Empire at this time is run very much by local warlords in the Balkans, and essentially Miloš is the one who wins independence.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And all the way through the 19th century, I don't know how historiographical this is, but I definitely got a feeling when I was reviewing it that this doesn't feel like a state prepared for independence. And I don't mean that in a sort of condescending way. It's no one has really planned for this.
That's interesting because even though Yugoslavia might be considered, I mean, now we would consider it a failed state, during most of the 20th century, if you had to decide which communist country you were going to go live in, let's say you had to pick one, you'd probably pick Yugoslavia because they were much more successful.
Yeah, it was generally a much more, well, compared to the Eastern Bloc states, it was generally a freer country. And this is all in relative terms, of course, but compared to, say, Ceausescu's Romania, you'd have much rather lived in Tito's Yugoslavia.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a really great short story by this author named Penkov about the difference between like this village that was on like the Serbian-Bulgarian border. The boy who lives on the Bulgarian side and the girl lives on the Serbian side, and the girl wishes she was Bulgarian, but the boy's like, you have jeans and tennis shoes. Like, you're so much more free. Like, and I love Bulgaria. I'm living here right now, but I was surprised when I got to the Balkans and learned about Yugoslavia, how much better it would have been if you were like there in the 50s or 60s versus being in Russia or Ukraine or somewhere. Now, 90s, no. But that's a different story.
Yeah. And that's why they've got the huge nostalgia for it. Huge nostalgia for it, in a sense.
Oh, absolutely. I think every young person I met either in Serbia, not in Kosovo, but in Serbia proper, depending on how people's political views are of the different areas, and all of the Serbian Bosniaks that I met all had Yugo nostalgia, like big time, and really couldn't believe that people would rather be in different countries than working together economically. That was not something I expected to experience when I was there, but it was everywhere.
Yeah, there's this, the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek. I don't know if you've.
I mean, I've heard of him. I don't.
Yeah. Well, but he told a story about. I think it was about him. He went to Sarajevo during the war, and all of the parties in the war, both the Croat nationalists and the Bosnian government and the Serb nationalists, had been elected on strongly anti-communist platforms. But at the same time, he said you saw pictures of Tito everywhere. In every office, people hung a picture of Tito on the walls and would never dream of taking it down.
They're still like, and I'm sure you saw this when you were there, but they're still like, his name is everywhere. I was in this part of Bosnia called Srpska, which is an independent area inside of Bosnia that's full of Bosnian Serbs, and his name was like written really big in people's gardens so that you could like see it from the road. Like it is. And I just didn't know that much about him and didn't realize that people wouldn't view him the same way they view like Stalin or Hitler or something. And then there was all this nostalgia for him. And because he really, Yugoslavia was a different situation than other communist countries, which we learn about it so much as a monolith that it's just so interesting to learn about the details.
Yeah, I don't know if while you were in Belgrade you went to Tito's tomb there.
I did not get to go. Yeah,
but I went there, and it's a museum called the House of Flowers. It translates. It sounds better in Serbian, but it's called the House of Flowers, and it's also a museum of Yugoslav history. And Tito's tomb is really well kept and still really well guarded, and it's still a very beautiful place.
Well, that's interesting.
Even when I went there with the rain chucking it down.
It's always funny when you're like not somewhere and then part of why I really love traveling to places to learn about history is you just get somewhere and you realize that like the stories that we are told are not the stories that locals have. Like I went to the West Bank and we did an episode on the West Bank. It's like episode 4 or 5. But one of the things I didn't mention in that episode was visiting Arafat's tomb and seeing it guarded and seeing it in this beautiful marble. And it's just like, no one ever would have told me, like growing up, that like one day I would visit Arafat's tomb and watch locals be like struck with awe. Like it's just, you learn so much when you see people in their like real habitat. So yeah, so let's talk a little bit about Yugoslavia proper. So after World War II, between World War II and the 90s, it was this different place that was different than the rest of the communist bloc countries. Like, what was it like to be in Belgrade in that time?
Well, just in Yugoslavia in general during that time, the kind of socialist economy that they pursue is quite different to what happens in the rest of Eastern Europe. In the rest of Eastern Europe, they basically adopt the Stalinist model of a command planned economy. Whereas in Yugoslavia, what they do is quite different. They set up these lots of small to middle-sized companies that are owned by the state, but which are essentially managed and run for profit, essentially, by their employees.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which is quite a different way of running things, and they compete against each other. So it's a kind of market system, but still a socialist system, if you understand what I mean.
Is that part of why Yugoslavia was a better economy than other communist countries of like similar size?
Yeah, it's also partly due to how Yugoslavia positions itself politically. Yugoslavia doesn't want to follow orders from Moscow, essentially, so it sort of breaks away from the Eastern Bloc in 1948, just a few years after the wars ended, and from there on sort of occupies this middle place in between the US and the USSR, and that gives it more access to financial help and loans from the Western capitalist states.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and it becomes this sort of leader of decolonization and third world liberation struggles, and a lot of like major anti-colonial leaders, people like Gamal Abdel Nasser and Nehru, the Indian independence leader, go to Belgrade and become close friends with Tito, and they form this, what they call the non-aligned movement, which is sort of left-leaning states not aligned with either the Soviet Union or the US, which is sort of like the third group within the Cold War.
That's interesting. I don't think I knew that there were countries that were not aligned with one or the other. I don't think we covered that. Yeah.
Well, they don't get that much attention, essentially because they don't have that much impact on it. They don't compete with the main two sides effectively.
But they have time to do their own thing, and they're pouring their resources into developing their own country instead of being part of a bigger system.
Yeah, they all take this essential model of state-directed economic development rather than a full market economy.
Let's talk about Yugoslavia in the 80s, the unraveling in the 90s, because when I learned a lot about the war, it was always really focused on Bosnia, and I don't think I really understood what was going on in Belgrade and Serbia proper at the time. And two, it's hard to like wrap your head around if you don't know a lot about it, what even was going on that caused it to become a full-on ethnic war.
Okay, well, this is obviously quite a complicated history question.
Could you cover it in 5 to 10 minutes, please?
Okay,
I'm just kidding.
I'll try.
I'm just kidding.
Well, obviously, Yugoslavia after World War II is divided up into 6 republics, which is what they're called. So Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, and Macedonia. And Montenegro as well. Sorry, I forgot Montenegro. And inside Serbia, there's also these 2, what they call autonomous provinces, which are Kosovo and Vojvodina in the north. And at first, these provinces are quite symbolic. They're in deference to the nationalist ambitions without giving them independence, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
From the 1970s onwards, power starts to be decentralized to the Republic administrations quite a lot more, until by about the late 80s, most things, apart from the army and the foreign affairs, are being run at the Republic level. That's not a problem, really, while Tito is still alive, because you still have this grand, unifying, charismatic leader who holds everything together, and he is the ultimate source of legitimacy within the country. Once he's gone and there's no obvious replacement, the leaders of the various republics start to compete against each other. Now, at this point, this still isn't a nationalist conflict so much as it is just a self-interested conflict. But then in the late 80s, you get a minor apparatchik in the Serbian branch of the Yugoslavian Communist Party, or the League of Communists, as it's called Slobodan Milosevic. And then he decides to essentially adopt nationalist ideology and language as a way to propel himself to power. A lot of people used to think, particularly when the 90s was going on, that Milosevic was a true believer in all the nationalist ideology. Most people now don't think he was. Most people now think he was putting it all on to gain power, essentially. And he starts trying to use this nationalist ideology to become the central figure in Yugoslavia in the same way that Tito was. But obviously that provokes a lot of opposition to that in the other republics, particularly in Croatia and Slovenia, where Serbs are a minority and form a small part of the population. In fact, there are hardly any Serbs in Slovenia, but in Croatia, at least before the war, there was a sizable Serb minority, about 10 to 15% of the population, but obviously the majority of the population weren't particularly conducive to the Serb nationalist language that Milosevic was coming out with.
So, if I remember correctly, Slovenia peels off relatively peacefully.
Yeah, Slovenia goes in, I think it's July 1991. I might have got the month wrong. And the Yugoslav army fights essentially a symbolic war, just to show that, yeah, we don't agree with this, but they give up fighting relatively quickly, because Milosevic by this point doesn't care about keeping Slovenia inside Yugoslavia.
Oh, interesting. Why was that?
Because by this point he's accepted that Yugoslavia is falling apart, but he now believes that he can keep large chunks of it together as a sort of greater Serbian state.
Okay. And because there are not a lot of Serbs in Slovenia, he's not even thinking of that as like a Serbian.
No. What he's really thinking of is Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia, and the border areas of Croatia, the Krajina.
Okay. Yeah. How does it go from Slovenia kind of peeling off peacefully to all hell breaking loose?
Well, first I should say that they try to resolve the inter-party disputes between the different republics in 1989 at the sort of Communist Party Congress, and that falls apart, and as a result of that, they decide to open the political arena up to any parties. They introduce free elections, and they hold those elections within each republic. Slovenia and Croatia elect leaders who are more or less committed to independence. Slovenia breaking away isn't so much a problem, except insofar as Croatia only is really willing to stay within Yugoslavia as long as Slovenia's in as well. As Slovenia breaks away, Croatia starts to break away as well, and in response to that, you start to see a Serb nationalist rebellion in the border areas of Croatia, where there's a sizable Serb population. And Milosevic, when Croatia starts to break away, Milosevic sends in the army, the Yugoslav army, to these border areas to try and stop them breaking away with the rest of Croatia, to try and hold them into his idea of an expanded Serbian state. And that's when you start to see the first appearances of ethnic cleansing in the wars, essentially, as the Croats in those regions are expelled, essentially as a fait accompli, to strengthen the Serb claim to the area. Like the Krajina, the border region of Croatia, which is taken over by Serb nationalist rebels in the early 90s, essentially, goes from about 55% Serb and 35% Croat to about 90% Serb in the course of about 2 years.
Oh, wow.
Because the Croats have been driven out. That's happening in Croatia. And then when we get to Bosnia in 1992, in Bosnia, there's no particular ethnic majority. There's a Bosniak population, a Muslim Bosniak population, about between 40 and 45%, a Serb population of about a third of the population, so 35%, and a Croat population of about 15-20%. The elections are won by a coalition of nationalist parties from each of these ethnic groups, strangely enough, and they actually decide to work together for the first year or so, until Yugoslavia starts to fall apart, and then they suddenly realise they have completely different opinions about where Bosnia should go, whether Bosnia should go its own way, or whether Bosnia should stay in. Because obviously the Serb nationalists want Bosnia to stay in this newly emerging greater Serbian state that's going to result from the collapse of Yugoslavia, in their opinion. Whereas the Croat nationalists, Bosnia's a breakaway so it can be annexed to Croatia.
Okay.
Whereas the Bosniak nationalists want to stay in middle course. They're sort of ambiguous about staying in Yugoslavia, but eventually they want Bosnia to be an independent state. And that's when you start to see Serb nationalists essentially walk out of the government and start building up their own army.
Now, most of the atrocities that I know about happened like on Bosnian soil.
Yeah.
At least during this time, not all of the millennia that preceded it. But what's going on in Belgrade while this is happening? Is there violence there too?
Not full-scale violence, but by this point, Milosevic has quite effectively consolidated control over Serbia. There are elections, there are other parties, but they are carefully rigged so Milosevic doesn't lose. In particular, the presidential race in 1993, everyone thought that Milosevic was going to lose to this other guy called Milan Panic, a Serbian American who'd come back to Serbia as a big businessman, and everyone thought he was going to win, and then he didn't win, and a lot of people thought that Milosevic had essentially rigged the result. And there is there are protests against Milosevic's control of the media and control of the police, which he uses as a very repressive tool. But we never see open war break out in Serbia the way it does in Bosnia or Croatia.
In Serbia, were there a significant Croatian or Bosniak population?
There are. The north of Serbia is a region called Vojvodina, and the majority of people in Vojvodina are Serbs, but there is also lots of minority populations there, particularly Magyar, the Hungarian minority populations. But there was also a small Croat minority in Vojvodina. There were quite a few far-right Serb nationalist rallies there, and a lot of thugs turning up and not explicitly expelling the Croats from their homes, but sort of trying to get them to leave. And that happened to about 10,000 people. About 10,000 Croats did leave as a result of this. With regard to Bosniaks, there's a region in the southwest of Serbia called the Sanjak, which sort of straddles the border between Serbia and Montenegro, and there Bosniaks are the majority.
Let's go a little bit into what happened in Bosnia, because I don't know. Just being there and So I didn't go to Sarajevo, but I was in Mostar, and the sniper tower and the buildings that are still destroyed, and it's crazy. And I know this is an episode about Belgrade, but it's hard to understand Belgrade if you don't understand what happened in Bosnia during this time. And it is
Mostar in particular. It's, as a guy I know who lived in Mostar, and he said it's that if you cross from one side of the river to the other, everything's different. There's a different public transport company and things like that. It's just because the Croat side and the Bosniak side insist on having separate institutions for everything.
Now, how does it devolve into Serbians and Croats fighting Bosniaks like openly, and how does the ethnic cleansing really get underway?
In the first situation, because when we start to get these political disagreements about whether Bosnia is going to go independent or not, essentially at that point the Serb nationalists refuse to even consider the issue. They walk out rather than contemplate independence. And from that point on, they, led by Radovan Karadzic, start to build up their own army, essentially being supplied by Belgrade. And then when an Bosnian independence referendum is held in April 1992, which they all boycott, and as such results in a overwhelming yes vote to independence, they then start to mount sort of coup d'etats all over eastern and northern Bosnia. At first, what they do is essentially purge anyone who isn't a Serb, or anyone who is a Serb but might not be loyal to them, from the town's administration. Make sure it's one of their men in the chief of police role. Make sure it's one of their men who's mayor, who's in control of the local newspaper, etc. And that's a pattern that's repeated all across northern and eastern Bosnia, in pretty much every town. And from then, there's a gradual descent into the situation getting harder and harder for the non-Serb population, and in some places it just descends into open massacres. They just virtually almost a couple of days after they've conducted the coup, they round up the Bosniak men and drive them to a river and shoot them all into the river, or something along those lines.
Yeah, it's. I was walking around Mostar, and there were just like graves of people that were all killed in, I want to say 93, 94, and some of them were like 12 years old, and it's.
Yeah, it's unpleasant.
Now, what was weird to me, so I went to Mostar first, then I went to Kosovo. So I was not prepared to like modern Belgrade, I was also not prepared to appreciate the people that are in their 20s and how hard they're working to make Serbia a great place. So especially considering that we haven't even covered what happened in like 2004 to 2008. Yeah. So let's cover a little bit about the situation with Kosovo, because I think people just don't understand it. If you're not there, it's hard to understand. There is hope at the end of the story, because there's a reason I think people should go to Belgrade, and it's different than the reasons people should go to maybe like other historical places. Like Belgrade's also like a very fun modern place with people that are working really hard, but it's got a sad past.
Yeah.
So how does the war in the 90s wrap up, and then let's talk about Kosovo.
Right. So essentially, the war in we've got to talk about this as two separate wars almost. The war in Croatia wraps up essentially because the Croatian army builds up between 1991 and 1995. And in August 1995, they suddenly unleash a lightning, very invincible offensive against the Serb rebels, and they're completely washed out, and a lot of Serbs are expelled as well. And that's essentially the end of the war in Croatia. The war in Croatia essentially ends with a complete victory for the Croatian army. In Bosnia, there's a brief war between the Croat nationalists, well, a war within a war between the Croat nationalists and the Bosnian government in 1993. But by 1994, 1995, the situation has sort of stabilized. The Serb nationalist army has seized control of most of the territories they want. There's still a handful of enclaves in eastern Bosnia that are holding out, but they're not really going on the offensive anymore. They're not trying to take any more territory. Their main problem is that there are a lot of sanctions are being put on Milosevic and Serbia, who are of course their main military supplier. And eventually Milosevic, to get the sanctions taken off, cuts supplies to them almost completely. And this is the point at which they start to get pushed back by the Bosnian army. And when they've been pushed back a bit, so that the Bosnian army and the Serb nationalist army control about half of Bosnia each, that's when the Americans step in to negotiate or impose, I guess, this peace agreement, whereas essentially they partition Bosnia between the two sides. The Serb nationalists get Republika Srpska, and the Croat nationalists and the Bosnian government, who by this point have teamed up together again, get what's called the Federation of Bosnia.
And Srpska, Srpska is a really cool, weird place. I quite enjoyed being there. I was there for like 3 days, but it is like an independent republic inside of, it's kind of like Transnistria in Moldova or North Cyprus in Cyprus.
It begins very much like those states. The difference is that those states still haven't formally been accepted, sort of like within, they're still unrecognized breakaway states, whereas Srpska has become a part of the Bosnian state, essentially.
So what is the time between the end of the war with Bosnia and Bosnia's independence and then the rise of the issues with Kosovo? And is Milosevic in charge for all of this?
The issue with Kosovo has been underlying for quite a while. I should probably go into some background in Kosovo here. Kosovo is was an autonomous province within Serbia, within Yugoslavia. And Kosovo's population was, by the late 80s, probably about 80 to 90% ethnically Albanian. And Serbs were quite a small minority there. But because of Kosovo's history, which I don't want to go into, it's got a huge symbolic significance for Serbian nationalism. And so they wanted to keep it within Serbia, regardless of what the demographics were or what the population there wanted its political situation to be. And Serbs from Kosovo claim that they are being persecuted and forced out of Kosovo, and whereas the Albanians say Serbs are leaving Kosovo because Kosovo's poor and they're going to richer places. And eventually in 1990, as part of his consolidation of control over all of Serbia, Milosevic sends the army into Kosovo and essentially cancels its autonomous status and just governs it as any other part of Serbia. Initially, the Kosovo Albanian population reacted not by a violent resistance, but with more civil disobedience, non-violent style protests. And in particular, they try to set up lots of parallel institutions. Like, they don't go to the state schools, they go to their own locally organized schools instead, that they've set up on an unofficial basis. And their hope is that with the world's attention dragged to Bosnia and Yugoslavia more broadly, that their issues will be solved as a part of this. That eventually Bill Clinton and the Americans will get round to them and help them. And then the war ends in both Croatia and Bosnia in 1995, and it doesn't happen. That everyone's forgotten about them, essentially. The Milosevic regime continues as normal. And then in the late 90s, in around 1997, 1998, you start to get a turn towards more violent methods with the rise of the Kosovo Liberation Army, the KLA. And they start undertaking mixes of terrorist attacks and more actual guerrilla attacks, more conventional guerrilla attacks. And this does drag some attention to the situation in Kosovo, and eventually the Americans bring both the Serbian government and the the KLA leadership to peace talks and propose a deal called the I can never pronounce it. I think it's the Rambouillet Agreement. And I'm not going to go into its terms specifically, but the Serbian government turns it down and starts launching an offensive in Kosovo, essentially to crush the KLA. And as part of that, they drive a lot of the Albanian population out of the country. And then the Americans react by beginning a NATO air bombing campaign, mostly in Kosovo, but also in the rest of Serbia, until the Serbian government gives up and agrees to allow NATO to move its troops into Kosovo to occupy it. And essentially at this point, even though Kosovo is still officially part of Serbia after that point, Serbia has no control over it. It's being administered effectively as a separate state from about 1999, 2000 on.
Yeah, so these NATO bombings are why there are NATO bombing the why you visit like the site of NATO bombings in Belgrade, correct? It's that bombing campaign. And having gone to Kosovo and Serbia, the information on the internet is a little bit misleading. If you actually want to go between them, you have to go into Serbia first, then cross into Kosovo. Otherwise, if you cross into Kosovo, like from Montenegro or from Estonia, and then try to go to Serbia, Serbians will consider you to have illegally crossed into their country because they still consider Kosovo theirs.
Yeah.
It's it's interesting, but all the routes, just as a travel tip, all the routes I found online were wrong. You cannot go. It was like you have to cross into Serbia first if you want to go to both of them back to back.
You either have to bring a second passport that's blank so they don't know you've been to another country, or you have to go round in a particular way. Yeah,
which is just, anyway, if anybody is planning on doing that trip and wants some tips, you can hit me up on Facebook because I have lots of tips for how to go between the two. But the bus driver in Kosovo wouldn't let me on the bus until he saw that I had been stamped into Serbia because he knew I would just get left at the border. So let's talk about modern Belgrade because that stuff wraps up in about 2008, I believe.
There's the fall of Milosevic in 2000. Big protests forced Milosevic out of power in 2000. Then in 2006, Montenegro breaks away and becomes independent. Because up until this point, Serbia and Montenegro have been the only two republics in Yugoslavia that have remained.
Which is funny because they're contiguous, but only like a tiny bit. And those would have been funny maps. I don't think I ever...
So Montenegro breaks away in 2006, and then Kosovo declares independence in 2008, and it gets partially recognised but not fully. It still hasn't been admitted to the UN, and essentially that's still the situation now, where we're still essentially negotiating under what terms and how Serbia will accept the independence of Kosovo. I think everyone except the far right extremists in Serbia have essentially accepted that Kosovo is now going to be independent. They might not, as much as they don't like it, they've accepted that it's now going to be an independent state.
Yeah, my experience was talking to people was just that they were hurt, angered by the fact that they believe a lot of what Kosovo did was terrorism and is still doing terrorism. And is going to elect someone that they believe is a terrorist. I don't know. Honestly, don't know enough about it to know what my opinion of the situation is on that particular issue.
The closest analogy I can think of to the Serbian attitude regarding Kosovo is the Israeli attitude to the West Bank.
Interesting. That's the second time that we've been like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, like as in they perceive it as something they'd really rather not give up.
Yeah, it's just further along on the way.
Because of historical, nationalistic-y, romanticized reasons, even though most of the people who actually live there want something completely different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how does Belgrade go from this capital where they're having to kick out a dictator? Not that he was a dictator really of Serbians, but he was doing things outside of the country in the name of Serbia, but where they're having to force him out and he's considered a war criminal. How do we go from that situation, NATO bombings, all of this, to 2017 when it's kind of a lovely place full of very optimistic young people who are working really hard to make the world a better place? And I met some of the most liberal, hardworking, passionate people that I've ever met anywhere. And it's just not what I expected before I got there.
Well, Belgrade's always been more a centre of liberal and progressive opinion within Serbia. I mean, let's not forget that there were huge protests against Milosevic throughout his time in power. There was always a substantial segment of the population who really didn't like him at all, who thought that his policy towards Bosnia and Croatia was damaging the country, that he was responsible for the UN sanctions that were being imposed on them. He was responsible for them being treated as an international pariah state. It's that memory, in a sense, which drives the progressive opinion in Serbia. A lot of them want to join the EU and move on from the past, essentially. They don't necessarily want to say they're sorry for it or anything like that, but they want to move on from it. Yeah, and
they have at least right now, they have a pretty peaceful relationship with Bosnia. It seems like they've done a lot of work, and outside groups have done a lot of work in reconciliation, which is something that's really important. I met people in both countries who were from both countries and had different memories of what had happened before, but were pretty peaceful with what was happening now. What were your experiences like when you were there? Because you were there last summer.
Well, I was there as a summer school thing, so I was there for academic reasons, essentially, with people from all around the world. But one of the things we were given there was a few events that we went to, and there was a tour of we went on a tour of Belgrade, in particular with to sites of the refugee crisis.
Oh, the current Syrian refugee crisis?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Obviously, a lot of refugees had passed through Belgrade in the previous couple of years, and apparently they were saying in Serbia they had a lot more of there was a much more welcome reception than there was in a lot of other countries, because Serbs know more what it's like to be refugees in recent memory.
Oh, interesting. What were the attitudes that you encountered about the refugees from Serbians?
I can't really say, to be honest, because I wasn't asking everyone I saw about it. This was mostly just as part of the tour that we were given at Belgrade. But then we also watched a film. So there was a film hosted for us about the war in Kosovo from a Kosovo Albanian perspective, and there was no protests or anything about it happening, which in my opinion it shows that I'm willing to reconcile with the Kosovo issue.
That's interesting, because I went on a walking tour with this organization called Experience Belgrade, and they're one of the organizations that do like free walking tours around the city. And the way that they make money is the guides depend on tips. So it's kind of, it's not really free. It's kind of like a pay what you want situation. And my guide was lovely. I would highly recommend the tour. It's a free walking tour. I didn't do it as like a sponsored thing. They did invite me to come via Twitter that day because I tweeted like, I'm in Belgrade eating nachos. And they're like, why don't you come do a tour? And I was like, okay. The Kosovo issue was still very emotional to my guide, who was, a guy in his mid-20s, not necessarily. I was more than I expected. So it's interesting to see that there was a movie up and nobody was doing it, like that it was just peaceful.
Yeah, well, there is definitely an effort in recent years to showcase Belgrade as a sort of modern, progressive European city. I
really recommend people travel to Belgrade and experience it for themselves and learn about it for themselves, because you can't. It's just so different than how you expect it to be when you hear everything else. But then you meet the people and you're like, it's a really complicated issue. So Alex, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it, especially because I think it, just like with your podcast, it's hard to stick to a specific amount of time when you're talking about these places, because everything is like, there are so many questions behind every question, and that's part of why Americans and Westerners don't know enough about this part of the world, is it's such a big topic. So where can people find you if they want to learn more and they want to follow along with your work?
They can find me either at the History of Yugoslavia on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, or they can find my website at ethnopolis.co.uk.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Oh, sorry.
I do have a Patreon site as well, and that's linked in most of my episode descriptions.
Excellent. So, and actually that's perfect, because I'm going to be explaining what Patreon is in the outro of this, because I just launched one myself too. So if people go follow along with you and then like your work, definitely check out his Patreon page and think about supporting Alex, because it's really important work for people who... He's telling us a story that hasn't been super accessible in an easy to understand way. So thank you so much for coming on.
No problem. I've enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
I want to say thank you again to Alex for coming on the show. We barely scratched the surface during our conversation today, so please check out his show, The History of Yugoslavia, to learn more about this fascinating and important topic. Housekeeping. This episode drops on Monday, which is my last full day in Tunisia. If you want to see pictures from my trip, I posted some awesome pictures from the Tophet of Carthage and from some really cool Roman sites here in Tunisia, and some beautiful picture of Islamic buildings. So definitely check out the Facebook page or my Instagram account if you want to see pictures from my trip. Both of those are History Fangirl. If you are interested in keeping up with my next trip, I will be leaving for Asia on January 2nd. So that's coming up soon. So there's lots of stuff going to be going on my social media feeds. So check those out. Again, those are at History Fangirl. If you want to support the show, a great way to support the show would be to go to the Patreon page and sign up. There are levels where you can get a postcard for my travels every month. There's a level where you can get a refrigerator magnet every month, which I think is a really cool one. And there's other levels too. So if you want to be super generous, there's some really crazy ones. But I think the postcard and the magnet levels are really cool. If you want to support the show, but you don't want to be a Patreon patron, you can also go to my website, go to the shop, and check out the t-shirts there. There are 2 shirts. One is ancient Roman history themed and one is ancient Greek history themed. And those are both available on historyfangirl.com. We have men and women's sizes. And you can also rate and review the show in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. That is always significantly helpful. Thanks for listening.